All right. Okay, we got one after. So we'll go ahead and just get started. For anyone who hasn't joined our webinars before, my name is Kendall. I'm our fashion and beauty director here at Trendalytics. So I'm excited to walk you guys through this season. It definitely was an interesting one. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we will dive into the deck. All right, let's get it going out here. Hey guys, so we are going to be doing our biannual Runway to Retail webinar for fall winter 2026. So we are going to be looking at all of the trends that we feel like can translate the most to the retail space. Okay, so we are going to be going over our overall aesthetics of the season, color, fabric, and print trends, and then getting us into our key trends within ready-to-wear accessories and beauty. Okay, so firstly, you're kicking off our four aesthetics that we'll dive into each a little bit more here. Okay, so the first one is called Take Me Back. So, as we know, it's never a season without nostalgia, but fall winter 2026 has taken us quite far back in time and really all over the board. So, we've seen nods to office attire really from the 80s with some power dressing, but even floated more towards like the 50s and the 60s this season. Lots of midi skirts, lots of skirt suiting, a color palette fit of the Depression era that we began to emerge last season. If you remember chatting about this last season, we really talked about this more of a muddy palette that felt very like these light steel blues, this very like muddy or dusty mauve, rather than the bright, fun pastels that we saw over the past year or so prior. We even saw Elizabethan era ruffs as an accessory to intricate jacquards and florals. So, like I said, there is just an array of different trends that feel like they are taking us way, way back in time, whether it is just a couple of decades prior or looking at thousands of years back. So, if you look over at the mood board on the right, you can see those jacquards as mentioned, different sorts of office attire, and even a lot of movement within heritage prints and suiting and tailoring updates. Okay, so getting us into our next trend aesthetic called More is More. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call this messy chic, the aesthetic that's currently rising on social media. I would say this really kind of feels like there is no element of chic that's happening here, but definitely an embrace of messy. So it feels very much that there are no rules, anything goes, and there is an emphasis on personal style. Designers like Prada, Marni, and Valentino are tapping into layers for the sake of fashion, not necessarily warmth. By color blocking with mixing neutrals as well as punchy hues. We'll dive into that a little bit more, but I really did find that color blocking with neutrals to be quite interesting. As we know, we typically see this, especially looking at our last season, where it was a lot of bold primaries being mixed together. And this was a lot of mixing of browns with grays, with blacks, all into one outfit. And then going over the top with accessories. So definitely not a minimalistic approach here, but looking at chunky necklaces and earrings, layering in there were so many stockings that were on the runways this time around. Also so many opera gloves, which wasn't one of the biggest trends. I didn't throw it in here, but we'll mention it now. Lots of opera gloves that were throwing in all the way from Copenhagen to Paris, which was interesting. And then some of these more oversized bags that feel a little bit more like they have these fun shapes to them. Maybe it's like this one in the center here, where we have this very liquid-like approach to the leather and in a really nice juicy burgundy shade. Okay, and so getting us into the new minimal. So I feel like there's more and more in this new minimal. We've been talking a lot, really even looking at like the Carolyn Bessette from Love Story and her style, of course, is so minimal, but also has a little bit of this like messy element to it. And I think that this is also showing up on the runways in a different sort of way. But minimalism, it really isn't about that perfect white t-shirt, but it's how can you bring the most personal style and creativity to these wardrobe staples. I feel like this mood board really represents us well, where we're looking at staple items here, right? Like a great sweater, a trouser, an amazing blazer dress. Looking at these cape pumps over on our bottom right side, which, I mean, it's a great pump, of course, but the high vamp, if you've looked at the details on the accessories here, just creates this really cool element of interest that it's not the same black pump that everybody has, but you're bringing your own personal touch to it. Whether it's you as a shopper or you as a designer, what are those cool little extras that feel extra special? So, like I mentioned, a few different ways we saw this with tailoring, challenging our tailored norms, exquisite draping. A return to lots of subtle prints like plaids and checks are just absolutely everywhere. I would also throw in here, there's a lot of movement with texture that we'll begin to talk about later, but with boucles, tweeds, just variations on different wools. That was quite interesting. And then different, very nostalgic, but also classic accessories. So looking at lots of A-frame bags, these elongated clutches, oversized sunglasses, and stockings being put into here as well. Okay, and then our fourth storyline of the season, looking at or calling it this the dark side. And so we talked about this a little bit last winter. We were talking about this witchy undertone that was coming up. And I would say that that continued and then gave us a couple different lenses here. So New York really kicked us off with some grunge feeling plaids. It felt very like rock and roll era. Lots of deconstructed garments really overtook the New York runways that felt a little bit more dystopian or gritty. Where then I feel like as we moved more towards Paris and through the European weeks, it felt almost a little bit more like ethereal, vampire-esque, more of that witchy undertone that we talked about. But I don't necessarily think that everything had to be so soft and romantic like we are seeing in the middle here. But looking down at like our bottom right, for example, that feels kind of like a nice blend of both, right? Where we have some of that grittier corseting with the zebra print. There's a pop of different neutral on the belt, but then we have asymmetrical hemline happening on the skirt. So the juxtaposition I do think is quite cool in that one. Um, but yeah, so anyway, so getting us back into like the rise of velvet, these very curve hugging silks that feel incredibly flattering, but isn't necessarily clung to the body. These very much, yeah, sweeping vampire-like gowns. All in all, leaving us with a lot of this gothic feel, both from our ready to wear and then into beauty as well. Lots of this like undone look that feels a little bit grungy, feels like a lot of slept in liner. We have those like just bitten, smudged lip liners as well. So lots to be playing with here that feels just a little bit more gritty. Okay, so just want to quickly pop us into our color palette, not touching on so much the neutrals here, but what are some of these other colors that really grew? So I feel like we moved past from we had a lot of primaries last season, and we're looking at just off primaries happening here. So I loved this vintage grape shade that really felt like a true purple, but almost brought into leaning in a little bit towards like a plum with, but still feeling very, very rich. This chartreuse shade, I feel like this has been a big conversation amongst my industry friends on if we've loved it or hated it. But there is a lot of this chartreuse. I would say I'm using this tone as an anchor because oftentimes it leaned a little bit more yellow, and others it leaned more into this key lime territory that felt more green. I loved the addition of mulberry. Seeing this evolve really from our burgundy or wine that we were looking at the last year, but more in towards a little bit of this purple toned mulberry that feels just really, really lovely. And even looking at some of those numbers here, that mulberry shades are already clocking within the market, being up 136% in market adoption. So products being added to assortments by brands and retailers here. Next, getting us down into some of this marigold shade. We talked about this a lot within our fall winter 2026 forecast that we put out last year of a lot of these jewel and gemstone shades rising. So a marigold or a topaz, looking really beautiful here. Rising is into not so much buttery yellow, but a buttercream. So again, looking at these neutral shades, but how are we just making them a little bit more interesting? So less of that big punchy yellow, but bringing us back down more towards a really nice buttercream or latte-like shade. Currently, we're seeing this up 100% already within market adoption. And then lastly, looking at oceanic blues, pulling in this one, we're really anchoring in that cobalt continuing on from last season. But with that being said, there was a lot of playfulness within blue and within our cool tone colors, as you can see here. But lots of shades, even getting us into more of that like really rich, like capri blue or some of those more fun teals as well. All right, so we'll dive in a little further here now and get more specific. So, looking at our print selection, so I'm just picking out our top three to chat about today. But if you do check out our full report that you will be sent after the webinar wraps up, you'll be able to see a little deeper look at more trends than we're just talking about in our webinar today. So, first and foremost, kicking off animal stripes. So, we did see a lot of animal print, even including leopard and deer, more of those dotted looks. But I would say that zebra and tiger really ran over the runways here. So, this example from Isabel Marant is a great one, just a different take on zebra with this lighter ground and then a cool pop of metallic. Currently, Zebra is up 150%, 50, sorry, not 150, just 51% so far in social buzz. So, being chatted about amongst key influencers, as well as tastemakers like different publications and those of us who are just posting online. Then getting us into, as we mentioned, lots of nostalgia is happening this season. So vintage florals really are popping off as well. Lots of people talking about them online, currently up 120% in that same social buzz stat. This one by Roberto Cavalli featured a lot of roses within their collections. And I would say roses in general across the board were a really big standout when it did come to florals. I do feel like it adds a little bit more of this like winter tone and gothic feel to something like floral that we would initially assign or usually assign to a spring. But then lastly, getting us into plaids and checks. So, like that grungy undertone that we talked about, of course, Anna Sui is a great example over here. But lots of plays on some of these more bolder plaids, but very subtle plays on checks as well. Okay, so our interest in lace continued on this season. Lace is currently up 21% in searches to last year. And I think what's interesting now is that when lace really came back into the market, we started talking about it. It did feel very bohemian, and I do still feel like there's a lot to play for that as well. But with that being said, there's lots of ways where it's not just a big, bold, lace going on, but we're using it in more subtle ways with different trims and some that feels a very, like you mentioned, almost more of that gothic or even nods to lingerie details. Okay, so next up, I would say velvet is one to be having your eye on once again. As we know, velvet is one that cycles in and out, and I do believe that it'll be coming back in a big way for this upcoming fall winter. There was a lot of interest in different sorts of trousers, playing within fabrications, as well as lots of cool updates to denim. But I do just want to note that I do think that this is a cool play for something like a velvet, right? If it doesn't feel maybe if it feels too costume per se to have it in a dress, but maybe it's an interesting play in a trouser, or maybe it's with a different trim. So, fun ways to be playing with this here. Then, as I mentioned, texture is really something to be watching. So, using different textured wools, boucles, and then some tweeds, but I wouldn't say that it looked as preppy tweed is where my mind always initially goes, but more so of a really cool texture play happening here in a subtle tonal way. All right, and then let's dive us into our top ready to wear trends of the season. So, first and foremost, I do want to talk about fur and feather trims. There was so much happening here. I think we're looking at this current season, we had some pops of furs happening within a market this winter, but looking at this for such a big way for next winter, I think this will be incredibly interesting. As I mentioned, fur trim is already up 22% in market adoption to last year, but I do think that that number has a lot of room to continue to grow when creativity comes into play. There were some great ways where I was even seeing it on like the bottom of tops and dresses or with feathers up at the neckline. Lots of cool different fun iterations were happening. Tunic tops. This is an exciting one to see come back. Lots of really fun ways for this to be layered in. Seeing this here at Moschino, styled it with trousers, but I also saw this styled back to different skirts, and maybe it's fun plays on different asymmetrical cuts. So definitely something to be watching there. Lingerie details. I always love when lingerie details come back into play, but again, really moving past just corseting, but looking at different plays within stockings, within lace trims, bra tops. So lots of different plays happening here. As I mentioned, the lace trim is up 217% in social buzz amongst those key tastemakers, and we'll definitely continue to see that to grow. And then another great example too, how we saw our prior Zimmerman picture just prior for lace, and to see how different even this feels within the same collection of those use cases for lace. All right. So, getting us into our color blocking. As I already mentioned, color blocking was quite huge last season, but it really felt very bold. And I do think that this season, what felt the newest and coolest was this neutral color blocking. I think it would be really unexpected to be pairing, right, this very like chestnut brown with a taupe, with you have black within the bag, and then charcoal gray trousers. So I think that that's quite interesting. And I'm sure a lot of people will be like, that's something fun, a styling cue I didn't think of was to be playing with neutrals in that way. So I'm excited to see how that plays out. Stella McCartney really did it beautifully throughout her collection. Okay, and then getting us into midi skirts. Oh, I did want to mention super, super quick here. Looking at those stirrup bottoms. This is one I didn't feel big enough to throw into our presentation today, but wanted just to add lots of stirrups were in Paris specifically. Didn't see so much in the early weeks, but popping them into even like trousers here in Paris was quite interesting. All right, so next up, getting us into midi skirts. Lots of midi skirts happening, whether it was in suiting or it was just a one statement piece. I think this one by Givenchy is beautiful with that front slit and the plays that they did on these tonal leathers is really, really gorgeous. And then lastly, as we mentioned, these fashion layers, right? So not so much. It isn't necessarily all about like a coat and we're layering on for warmth, but it's this like pretty pop of lace and that's now layered over a cashmere turtleneck. And then there's also going to be a blouse on top of it. And then here we are also throwing in some stockings. So lots of these fashion plays. I would definitely notice texture here and print. That is really where that element of interest is coming into play. Okay, and then our last page for ready to wear is at stylized leather. There was a really big amount of crocodile on the runways this season. For example, crocodile is already up 129% in market adoption to last year, specifically definitely within the luxury category. So we can only expect this to continue to grow in our incoming year. With that being said, other ways to keep that leather very interesting. That worn look was very big, very much continuing on. We're seeing that a bit at retail already, but can expect that to keep on growing. And then even plays on different colors as well. So second off here is our maxi coats. As we've already been seeing them again come into the market, they're currently up 43% in market adoption to last year. So this is certainly something that's available to us now, but lots of plays on different fabrications and different ways just to keep them feeling fresh and interesting. But this was definitely a big one across the weeks. And then lastly, what I found to be interesting was the sheer amount of high-waisted trousers on the runways right now. This was clearly one to be talking about. As you can see, it's up 262% in social buzz amongst tastemakers. We, of course, were in such a big low-waisted season, even just last year. But the amount of high-waisted that we saw come back for fall winter 2026 was exponential, and specifically having it be within trousers. So quite interesting, something to be taking note of. Okay, so next I want to get us into accessories. One absolute standout is these oversized sunglasses. They are up 450% in social buzz at the moment, which is quite the number. So lots of people are partaking in conversations about them, whether it's about the runways or styling them on their own, but definitely quite interesting. I think we will be seeing a lot of these in the incoming year. As I mentioned already, lots of chat about stockings. That was really, really popular within different styling cues from New York and Copenhagen all the way into Paris. And then there was a lot of play on classic heels. So a T-strap heel, for example, you can see this one by Christian Dior. They're currently up 102% in market adoption, which that number honestly surprised me that a lot of plays were already happening, especially within the luxury market, of course. But I think that we'll continue to really see that this will grow. Some felt a little bit more literal than others, but I think this was really, really beautiful. And as I mentioned, other takes on classic shoes like the pump was getting a lot of updates as well with a higher vamp. So that was quite interesting. All right, and then getting us into chunky jewelry. So, as we saw last season, the pendant necklace was like the it jewelry item. We really started to rise this season with more chokers, and especially chunky ones as well. And then the chunky statement earring was like the key item that was just ruling in the runways. And next, getting us into belts. So whether it was C and maybe it's actually practical for that high-waisted trouser, but lots of waist belts that I wouldn't say are necessarily serving a purpose other than looking cool. You can see this Margiela example right here that's just sitting nicely on the waist, but this is on a dress, actually not a trouser. And then lastly, I think one of the most interesting ones that really had my attention, even in Copenhagen this season when I was there, was the amount of just like neck accessories. And so we're calling them neck accessories. Whether it is like a true classic tie, as we mentioned, those ruffs is so wild, or maybe it's this like big feather piece here. But just a lot of different options being played with. And I think that, of course, this doesn't have to be so extreme. But what are some things? Maybe it is like a beautiful silk scarf, a neckerchief, some of these more approachable ones that can be coming back. Okay, and then for our last section, we have beauty. So those side parts do continue on that we saw so much talked about last season, and there was like Gen Z on TikTok being like, "Oh my God, were the millennials right about the side parts?" But there was a lot of side parts happening, so fun to be watching. As I mentioned, that just bit in lip. So this is really achieved by maybe like a smudged lipstick or a smudged lip liner. So this is an exciting, or really just like fun. It brings a little grunge and a little different way to be utilizing those power products. And then looking at smoky eyes as well. So with so much grunge, so much of this gritty take, smoky eyes have been rising once again. Okay, and then getting us into our lived-in hair. So this is just a slight evolution of that more undone, beachy, wavy look that we saw so much happening at Chloe a couple seasons ago that just continued and influenced all the runways. But this is almost giving like it feels messy. It feels lived in, right? Like she maybe just like woke up, but she looks incredibly chic and she like layered everything on to go out and is, owning her Gabriella Hearst. We love that for her. So this very lived in look is quite interesting. And undone hair just in general is up 200% in social buzz at the moment. And then lots of talk about natural nails. I think this has been big on and off the runways, where maybe even always isn't just like a bare nail, but talking about maybe safer products or lighter shades, or how can we elongate that manicure even more? Maybe it's a Russian manicure. But we did see a lot of more of this natural look on the runways this season. And then lastly, getting into some berry shades. So blush felt very very rich, very pink, very pretty. And so this even kind of reminds me of that like mulberry shade that we saw within the ready to wear, right? All right, so we will take time for questions. But thank you guys so much for joining us this season. As always, we will do questions, but if you'd like to get connected, if you'd like to know more about the Trendalytics platform or have any questions that are a little more specific to you and your business, feel free to reach out at hello@trendalytics.co. Otherwise, I will stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions that they want to chat about now, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I know it's always someone's got to rip the band-aid, and then I know the questions always flood from there. Okay, so we have a bit of a different one, which I am happy to answer. But any thoughts on functional supplements in the beauty space? Happy to chat on that super quickly. Um, but yes, oh my gosh, this I think is such a very interesting portion to be looking at within beauty. We're really seeing wellness meet beauty, whether it is like skincare that has like some sort of coverage to it or vice versa. Beauty with, skincare benefits, things of that nature, I think is very, very interesting right now. But for supplements in general, I think the conversations around them are becoming a lot more open. It's a lot less scary. And so I think that she's a very knowledgeable consumer these days. So I do think that this is an interesting one to keep your eye on and definitely worth the investment dollars. I'm like a big, big supplement fan. Even personally, I like healed my hormones all through functional supplements, my own research, like years ago, even before all this information was out there. So I do think there's a lot of people who are starting to turn to this right now. Like, great. And then, okay, we have a couple others coming in here. So, any denim insights? Yes, great, great question. So, I thought denim was actually quite interesting, and I wish I had room to have added it into our webinar today. So, happy to chat about it more. But I thought denim felt incredibly interesting this season. There was a lot of plays on detail texture to our denim that kept it feeling very fresh. I will say the leg continued to feel relaxed. Like, it wasn't this, oh my gosh, we're running back to skinny jeans or anything of that nature. It really felt relaxed and almost, again, like mimicking that trouser look. But I saw some like raw hems, like raw, like trimmings on the sides. A lot of this like painted look continued on. Different, even with like darting playing to like have it look like trousers. But I just thought that the detail was incredibly, incredibly cool. Um, Hopefully that's helpful. But yes, I thought that that was really, I thought it was interesting. Like I didn't really see just a chic, dark, plain pair of denim. Everything had a really cool creative element to it. And lots of studs, lots of studs. So something to be keeping your eye on. Okay. So you mentioned right when you answer one question, that's when they all important, right? Okay. Um, this is a really good one. Is gray the new brown? 100%. I wrote that down in my notes. I'm like super old school where of course like I use our data for things, but I also as I look through the shows myself, you still got to sit and look at it. And I wrote in my notes like that exact question, like is gray the new brown? I would 100% say that it was. There was so much gray this season, and I think it fit very nicely into a lot of our trend stories. So a lot of different design houses were tapping into it. And I do think that there was a big play on grays as well. So some of those like deeper charcoals and some of those even like lighter grays that felt just very chic. And I do think using it a lot within that like wool boucle moment that was happening. So definitely lots to be happening there. When do you imagine the tipping point of that to be? I think really looking at like after we get over these beautiful, summer warm months coming in that I'm so excited for. But I think once that starts to wrap up and we start to enter back into our cooler, a little grungier era, right after the summer, I feel like that'll be coming in nicely and definitely lasting into 2027. Okay, let me take a quick look at all these. Other just quick follow-up question with that on the vintage grape. Same thing here. I think that coming up for that same time frame coming up into winter. I could actually see that being a great holiday color. Really sprinkling that into like a holiday dress assortment, and I think that would be awesome. So I think lots to be watching there. I will say, like I'm personally like shopping for Coachella right now, and I was even surprised at the amount of purple and teals in assortments at the current moment. But of course, like lots playing within, I would more so say within like fast fashion, but really interesting. I think it's going to come in a like a gorgeous, luxurious way later this year. I love this question. Okay, so next one, how will CBK's influence re okay, rearrange the changes? Oh, okay. Sorry. How will CBK's influence change these trends from Fashion Weeks? Okay, so I did think that this was quite interesting because obviously CBK and Love Story with JFK. If you guys haven't seen JFK Jr., if you haven't seen the show yet, it's very minimal, right? But that is where I did, as I kind of mentioned, saw more of that like messiness come in because yes, she was very minimal, but she had like a personal style to everything. And I think there's so many of these like posts online happening where like, guys, she's not necessarily like a West Village girl going to get her matcha and going to Pilates. Like she had a bit of an edge to her. And so I think that it's going to show us a new way to tap into minimal. And with that being said, I do feel like with some of these big crazy layers and things that we saw on the runway is it's like to be realistic, that's not for every consumer. Like I mean, even myself, like I wouldn't dare to wear half the stuff that we saw on the runways this season. But let's put that into something that is maybe a little bit more manageable, right? So maybe it is that like neutral color blocking. That feels kind of interesting to be mixing up your neutrals. Like, what does that feel like? So maybe it's bringing a different lens to that minimalism. So that actually was really what inspired that like new minimalism trend aesthetic that I threw in here as well. Okay. So a couple questions just on Trendalytics within general. Um, so w with the predictive element that comes in, where does all of that come in? Like, yes, so there's so many different data points. If you are interested, I highly recommend booking a demo with our team who can walk you through all the different things that Trendalytics can do. But there's so many different touch points that we look at. So we look at, as we mentioned today, it was like search, social media, market adoption, all of that good stuff. But it isn't just that alone. It comes into our algorithm, which is then where the predictive element comes in. So we're able to really feel good about that bet of like, okay, we're knowing all this information. We have all these different touch points. Can this project well into, 6 months ahead, a year ahead, 18 months ahead? And what does that look like? And how can we gauge our investment on it? So that's really where like that Trinalytics magic comes into play. Yeah, otherwise, guys, these were amazing, amazing questions. If you have any others, please, like I said, send us an email, hello@trendalytics.co, and then you guys will be receiving full report and recording coming up, hopefully tomorrow, if not on Monday. But thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it.